Hello, everybody. Welcome. We are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to those who are just tuning in right now. My name is Shireen, and I'm part of the Wacom team. And this is Storytelling Through Visual Media with Sky Bergman. So without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Sky Bergman. Not only is she a wonderful award-winning photographer and filmmaker, she was also my professor in photography school, and Sky has inspired me so much, and I hope she can inspire you today with her session. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Sky. Hi, Sky. How are you doing?
Hey, Shireen, thanks so much for having me. And Shireen was one of my favorite students. I'm so
Aw.
excited. It's turnaround. I love this cycle where now the student becomes a teacher. So I'm really, it's just wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So tell us a little bit more about you.
Yeah, so I recently retired from Cal Poly, although they still got me back there teaching a little bit full time, but or part time. But and while I was at Cal Poly, I started working on a film. I was a photo video educator, and I started working on a film called Lives Well Lived. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in my talk. I'm also working on two films right now called Mochisuki, which is coming out in May for Asian American Pacific Islander Month on PBS, and The Primetime Band, which is in production right now. And I recently released a book called Lives Well Lived Generations. So I'm super excited to be here. It's really just a joy. And I'm going to go ahead and get started because I have so much to share with you all. So the title of my talk is Creative Sparks Using Photography, Art, and Media to Enrich Storytelling. I think everything that I do is all about storytelling and how to make that more interesting and engaging. And I think that one of the things that's really a wonderful way of looking back is I look back and I found this photo of me when I was about 5 years old, holding a camera in my hand. So obviously, I like to tell stories from very early on, and I'm sure you all have some images like this as well. So why do we take photographs? There's so many reasons we take photographs: to capture memories, to tell stories, to communicate with others, to prove that something actually happened, to relate to each other, to reveal something, to celebrate. I mean, can any of you imagine celebrating a birthday or an anniversary and not taking a photo at this point? We need to show that that happened. Sometimes we take photographs to protect if something's happening, to document that something actually happened, and of course, to sell and advertise. And right now, we're so barraged by images on all social media in ways that we never were before. When I got into this, of course, we were shooting on film and there just wasn't as much imagery out there. But when we take photographs, we're also learning to see. I think that that's something that's really important. When you have a camera in your hands, you look at the world in a different way. And so when I think about it, what really is photography? Well, photography quite literally means painting with light. So anytime that I'm walking, I will just look at the light around me and how it's falling on things and what kind of compositions can be created by this beautiful light. And I love this quote from Chase Jarvis, which is, the best camera is the one that's with you. And one of the wonderful things in this day and age is that now everyone just about has a camera with them because our cell phones have become our cameras. And I teach a basic digital photography class. I would say 90% of the students do that entire class just with their phone. And that's fine because it's really not about the gear. It's about what you do with that gear and showing your vision. So I'm going to go through some of the basics to teach you how to create an image rather than just taking an image. And when I say that, it's not just taking an image and doing a whole bunch of shots. It's really thinking about how can you make the image what you want it to be. So
Sky,
there's
I'm just
really,
gonna
yeah,
jump in really quick. We just can't see your screen.
you're not okay. It says I'm sharing screen, so let me stop sharing and reshare again.
No worries.
Um, Are you seeing it now?
Now we are. There we go.
Okay, I'm so
Perfect.
sorry about that. Well, let me go back a few stages here because that's me at 5 years old that I was talking about holding the camera. So I'm sorry that you weren't seeing that. And you can see it's a pretty old camera, but boy, and I was super fashionable back then. But boy, that is kind of a fun image to look back on. So again, why do we take photographs? For all of these reasons, just so you'll have it in the recording. And again, what is photography? Literally, quite literally means painting with light. And so we're going to learn how to create an image rather than just take an image. So let's get started with some of the basic principles. So a few things are things, there's the triangle, the golden triangle, which is made up of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And I'll go into each of them and hopefully do it in a way that's creative so you'll be excited and inspired by it. Aperture, or also known as f-stop, literally controls the depth of field. That's really how much is in focus. Shutter speed controls the motion, and ISO controls the sensitivity to light. So what does aperture actually mean? What is depth of field? Quite simply, it just means how much is blurry or sharp in an area around your subject. So if we look at these two images, the image on the left has something called large depth of field, and the image on the right is a shallow depth of field. So when we talk about, sometimes you might have heard the word bokeh effect. You get this very shallow depth of field in the image on the right. And what that means is that the image on the left, when you're again creating an image, rather than just taking it, thinking about what depth of field you want in an image, because the image on the left, it's much more about the whole environment, whereas the image on the right, it's really about that one flower, and the environment is far less important. And when we photograph people, a lot of times, we will look at creating a shallower depth of field so that really the focus is on the person rather than the environment. So here in the ceramics lab, you can see that this little frog, it's much more the focus is on the frog. And here where you have a larger depth of field, you're seeing that whole room. So again, creating the feeling that you want. Do you want that feeling to be of the whole room, or do you want it to just be on one subject? And so again, large depth of field here versus a very shallow depth of field here. And another image, large depth of field versus a shallow depth of field. And I'm going to show you, there's a really cool thing for those of you that use iPhones, and I believe there's an equivalent on Android, and I'm going to my photos right now. When you shoot in portrait mode, and Shireen, I just want to make sure that you're seeing the flowers. You can just give me a thumbs up. When you shoot in portrait mode, you have the ability to actually change your depth of field after you've taken the photograph. So I highly recommend shooting in portrait mode, especially if you're shooting people. But I was just up in the Bay Area and I was shooting these beautiful flowers outside of the at Golden Gate Park. And one of the things that you can do is that on this upper right hand corner, you'll notice there's something that says depth when you edit your film or your image. And so you'll notice that there's a number, which is the f-stop. Now, again, this is done with software, but it really still gives you that same idea. So I'm going to take the depth of field and I'm going to make it super shallow. So the lower the number, the shallower depth of field. And you can see now how everything else goes out of focus except for this one flower where I have the focus. Now I'm going to just go all the way in the opposite direction, and now you see everything that's in focus, including that there's somebody back here where you couldn't even make them out before. So knowing that you can actually change that depth of field after the fact is kind of nice. And I'm going to go back to a shallow depth of field. And right now, you'll notice that I have a little box right here that's on this flower. But let's say I want to change that and I want this flower back here to be in focus. All I have to do is click on that. And then everything else goes out of focus except for that flower. Or I can do this one. And so it's picking that plane right there that's in focus, which is kind of a really fun thing that you can do. So even if you don't have a DSLR and you're just using your phone, you can still play around with that idea of aperture and what you choose as a photographer to have in focus and what you choose to have go out of focus. So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint, and again, Shireen, just let me know if this is working.
Yep, we can see.
Okay, great. So we've got a large depth of field where this is shot in Japan, and you see the cherry blossoms in the back a little bit. And you see this, everything is really much more in focus versus a shallow depth of field. And you can see what a difference it evokes as we're looking at that image. And personally, for me, in this particular image, I like the shallower depth of field better. And that's a personal choice. But for me, in this image, that works a little bit better. Now, the other part of the triangle that we have talked about or briefly is shutter speed. So shutter speed is used to show or imply motion with your camera. What does that mean? So if you're shooting with a fast shutter speed, it's going to stop the action of something that is moving. So you'll notice in this case, we have somebody on a unicycle there, and it's a fast shutter speed versus a slow shutter speed. Now that person is blurry. So if somebody is shooting a sports event, they're probably not going to want to have this blurry, slow shutter speed. You're probably going to want to use a faster shutter speed where you capture the action versus, and this is water, which is a really another nice, good example, versus a slower shutter speed where it almost looks like it's soft. And so if you see landscape photographers on the flip side, many times they like to have a slower shutter speed so that the clouds look a little softer or the water looks a little softer. Or if you've ever seen a night shot where there are lights that look like streaks, that is a slower shutter speed. So some really nice things you can do with shutter speed. And then finally, in part of that triangle is something called the ISO. That refers to the camera's sensitivity to light. So it used to be in the film days, and those of you, there might still be some people out there that are shooting film, you'd have a whole roll of film that had a certain ISO to it. And that was a sensitivity of light. And so for that roll of 24 or 36, that's what you had to work with. Now we're super lucky if you're shooting digitally, you can change that ISO number from one shot to the next. So when you increase the ISO number, you don't need as much light. So you might notice that if you're shooting inside, you can still photograph, but you're going to end up with noisier images. And let me show you what that looks like. So here on the left, we have a lower ISO. So you're not seeing as much of the noise. And then when we get to a higher ISO, look at what happens. You start seeing like very pixelated noise. Not that this is bad, and I would think about where are you going to use this image? Is it going to be on social media where people are going to look at it really small? You're probably never going to notice the difference. But if you're going to go out to print, you're going to see some of this noise. So just knowing that, and that, by the way, is why people pay more money for very expensive cameras, because the more expensive cameras they do better at a high ISO. They don't have as much noise to them. So if you have a less expensive camera, or you're shooting with your phone, a lot of times you really want to try and get as much light as you can so that you can have the ISO a little bit lower. So you have those three things, and those really make up how you're going to have an exposure. But now I want to talk a little bit about your eye and how you're going to compose things. And there is something called the rule of thirds. If you've ever done photography in the past, you've probably heard about the rule of thirds. So most of the time, if you look back at your images, I would say most of them are probably what I call targeting, which is that you've put your subject right in the center of the frame. And then these edges you're not really paying attention to. And that's okay. That's what we're used to doing. But one way to create an image that makes a little more interest is to think about putting whatever the subject is in where one of these green dots is, so that you have a little more interest, there's a little more balance to the composition, and it just you've thought about the background and the subject instead of just putting that subject right in the center of the frame. Now, there are times where that works really well to put the subject in the center of the frame, but I would challenge you to think about the next time you go out and photograph, how can you move your subject so it's not right in the center of the frame? How can you think about what's happening in the background and really take all of that into account? So it's not just about the subject and you've forgotten about the background. Because when you do that, that's usually when a telephone pole is coming out of somebody's head. So, really thinking about the subject and thinking about the background and where you're placing that subject in the frame is super important. And there are some visual elements of design that I think are also really things that you need to look at that are, this is one of the projects that I give my students early on, is to actually photograph each of these visual elements of design. So to go out and look for shape and form, for line, for texture, for color, symmetry and balance, perspective and repetition and pattern. And so I'm going to show you some of what that looks like. So shape and form, quite simply, is like an outline of an object's two-dimensional appearance. So it's really a silhouette or a black object against a bright background in its most basic form. And so if we look at something like this, we don't really can't make out what it is. I mean, we know because we can see the form that it's a pot with some flowers in there, but it's much more about the shape that you're seeing here. Or another time that you'll see really shape come into the forefront is when the sun is setting and we see people as a silhouette, and that gives you that shape. I also, in this particular photo, and again, these are all students that I have that I'm showing you, student work, love the reflection that's happening in this water. So really paying attention to how we can use that beautiful time of day after the sun has just set and those wonderful colors that come out and emerge in the clouds. And then again, shape in the form of a palm tree. So we're seeing really the outline. You know that these are palm fronds, but you can't see it in terms of that texture and that color. You're just seeing it in terms of the shape. And again, another shape and another form where you're not making out the object, but it's much more of just a silhouette. The next thing that's really important to look at is line. It's one of the most effective ways to draw a viewer's eye into the image. So it's one of those easy ways. If you look at man-made structures and objects as well as nature, you're going to see it everywhere now that we started talking about it. So here is a really nice example of line with bamboo. And by the way, I'm going to talk about all of these different design elements. Some of these images will fit into more than one category. So this fits into line. It also fits into repetition and pattern and texture. And again, books, the lines of the book, the lines of a building. So, and look at also these wonderful shadows that are created, which repeat those lines. So we're going to talk about light a little bit later on as well. That's another element that you're going to look at. So looking at lines in nature and how can we really have that as an element that takes over the whole image. And really looking at even this image, you see the lines in the front and then you see the lines of the building in the back. So you're shooting through something. And what does that look like? Or lines on the beach. We live pretty close to the ocean here. So we get lines on the beach. And texture adds drama and transforms a flat image into a three-dimensional image. So remember that photography is all about taking a photograph of a three-dimensional space and bringing it into the two-dimensional realm, but trying to keep that illusion of the three-dimensional space. How does that happen? That's really with light washing across the object so that you see highlights and shadows. That's really what makes something look three-dimensional, is that texture of the highlights and the shadows. So looking at wood and the light, and you can almost feel that texture. And what I tell my students when they do this assignment, which is something that a lot of photographers don't do. And again, look at your own images to see, is really move in close to things, move in closer than you think, maybe even making it a little bit abstract. So this is a basketball, but moved in so close that it's much more about the texture of the basketball. And you can almost feel it. You almost can reach out and touch it. And some corrugated cardboard here that, again, very, no other thing to notice, very shallow depth of field. Why do I say that? Only this area is in focus and this area in front and behind is out of focus. So a nice shallow depth of field. Moving in close to a leaf. And usually when we do this assignment of the visual elements, I take my students into a beautiful building that architecturally is just wonderful, has beautiful lines. And then from there, we go out to the Arboretum because I love the contrast of the man-made versus nature and looking for all these visual elements of design. So you can see in nature, there's so many wonderful visual elements of design, that texture again, the texture of the tree bark, and you can really feel it because the whole frame is filled by this texture. So again, you can see moving in really close on all of these, it makes it even more impactful. And again, on this image, very shallow depth of field, because we notice that here we are at a focus, here it's in focus, and then in the background, it's a little out of focus. So it gives the viewer a place to rest, which is where that image is in focus on that moss. A burlap sack. And then we have repetition and pattern. So it creates a sense of harmony and rhythm. And it's similar to texture in that creating that sense of drama. But pattern works the best when it feels like it could go on forever. So you'll notice that in these, there's not really the end of the chairs. It just feels like it can go on forever. There's that repetition, that pattern. Or the side of a building that we don't see the beginning or the end of. So really thinking about how can you use that in your own work so that we see that sense of repetition and again, feeling like it could go on forever, just the vantage point that this is shot from. And again, this one is repetition and pattern, but it's also about texture. It's also about a very shallow depth of field because we only have this part in focus and this is going out of focus. So using a lot of those elements that we just talked about, how can we bring that into our photographs intentionally so that we're really creating the image rather than just taking an image, thinking about is our vantage point? Where are we shooting from? Can we get down a little lower? Can we get up higher? Many times we end up staying at the same vantage point. And I think that if you, I'm short, and when I photograph, a lot of times I'll take a step stool so I can get above things because I can look at things from a different vantage point. Or if you are photographing animals or kids, it's really nice to get down to their eye level. So really thinking about where you are when you're photographing as well. What are you choosing to leave in the frame and what are you choosing to leave out of the frame? And in this particular case where we're talking about repetition and pattern, really moving in so that again, with even in this image, we're not seeing a beginning and end, and it feels like it could go on for a very long time. Symmetry and balance. This is where I said before to try and move things out of the frame, out of the center of the frame. In this case, we want to leave things in the center of the frame because we want that symmetry and balance and that harmony. And when things are in the center of the frame like this, they tend to give you more of that sense of harmony and balance. And again, another element of design in this is repetition and texture. So this straddles many of the elements of design. But you can see where when we put things right in the center of the frame, there's more of a sense of balance, a sense of calm. So how do you want to use that when you are creating image to bring in that sense of balance and calm to an image? And just looking at everyday ordinary objects, how can you find that even if you're just looking around your house, maybe making that a little assignment for yourself of how can you just look around at your environment and see where those things may be, where you can start looking at those visual elements of design. And we have perspective and vantage point. So I've talked a little bit about perspective and vantage point, thinking about how you can, where you are in relationship to what you're photographing. So looking at being, I love this one, being down low, right? And, this kind of reminds me of everybody that's been to Pisa does that whole same thing with the Leaning Tower of Pisa, but really playing around with our perspective and our sense of scale. And how can we play around with that, but also intentionally think about using different vantage points. So getting down to the level of this dried leaf, or getting low in the center of a road and really paying attention to that yellow stripe that's going down the road and leading us all the way into the back of the frame. So really thinking about changing where we are photographing from, just even doing that, if you try and do that just for a day, I can guarantee you're going to get some really different photographs. Looking up instead of just looking straight on. We tend to take all of our photographs from our eye level, from our vantage point. So what happens if we start changing that up a little bit and looking at different vantage points and looking at things in a different way? And then, as I said before, light is really what it's all about with photography. So your use of light is what separates a good photographer from a bad photographer. And I like to say that light is to a photographer what paint is to a painter. I paint with light and I love light. So I'm going to show you a little bit about what different qualities of light are. And so that you can really start building an understanding of how light affects your image and what is hard light versus soft light. What does that mean? And why would you care? Because it will really change the way that people, your viewer, will look at your images.
Sky,
So,
before you go into light, we
yeah.
have a question in the
Oh,
chat.
absolutely.
So when you go on photo walks, what is your favorite lens? Like, what's your go-to lens for that?
That is a really good question. I have to admit that when I go on my photo walks, I'm usually with my phone and not with my camera because it's much heavier. And so I just use whatever feels comfortable. If I am taking my big camera, when I travel, sometimes I'll take my big camera. I shoot with a Canon R5 for those of you tech geeks out there. And I usually take a 24-105 just because I like the flexibility of having a wider lens and then being able to zoom in. And so that's pretty much what I will shoot with when I'm going on a walk. Now, I do a lot of video work, and I'm going to show you a little bit of that when I am filming. My favorite lens is actually a 50 millimeter lens that's 1.2 because I like having a very shallow depth of field. I like separating the person from the background. So for me, that's something that no matter where I go, because I go into people's houses and many times I can't do anything about the background, but it's nice to be able to blur it out so that the person becomes a prominent thing. So does that help? Is that good?
I think that's perfect. Thank
Okay,
you.
okay. So now we're going to talk. This is exciting. I'm geeking out here because light is amazing. And really, when you know what a little bit about light, it's going to change your photography forever. So a small light source produces what's called hard lighting, and a larger light source produces soft lighting. What the heck do I mean by that? So hard lighting or harsh lighting, these are things that are considered small light sources. The sun, which might seem kind of weird, but it's because it's so far away that it's considered a small light source. A bare bulb, a candle, a flashlight, the flash on your camera. So hard light, when you'll know you have hard light when you see strong shadows and high contrast. That is what hard light is. Soft light. Soft light is really created by a large light source. So I love shooting when it's an overcast day or a cloudy day because basically the clouds are acting like a big diffusion screen from the sun. So you get these nice, soft, very soft, really nice light. Large studio lights like soft boxes. That's why they're called soft boxes because the light is bouncing through that soft box and then onto your subject. Window light from a north-facing window or one that doesn't receive direct sunlight. And open shade. What do I mean by open shade? Where you're someplace there's still light, but it's completely in the shade. So when you're looking at soft light, look for weak or no shadows and low contrast. So here's a really good, we say a picture's worth 1,000 words. So here's a good picture of hard light on the left versus soft light on the right. So it's not that hard or soft light is good or bad. They are used for very different things. So when we look at hard light, you'll notice that you can see here the shadow is definitely much more defined. You have a much brighter area and a much darker area versus in the softer light, there's a shadow, but it's very soft. That's the soft light. And you can see that it's almost like a flatter. You see, this looks a little more contrasty and this is much flatter looking. So here it is in action, and you'll notice that the image on the left is the harder light. Why do I say that? Because if I'm looking here, I'm seeing these harder shadows. And if I look on the right image, there's no shadows. So it feels different depending on what light source it is. So thinking about that when you're filming. Again, image on the left is soft light versus the image on the right is very hard light. And you can see the shadow that's created is almost a mirror image of the sunglasses. So a very different feel whether it's soft light versus hard light. Again, image on the right, notice the shadow here. We're getting a very hard light on the left and much softer light on the right. Same thing here, very different things, but here's soft light on the left versus very hard light and more contrasty. So you notice this looks lower contrast. This looks much more higher contrast. So the quality of light is really important because again, there is no you should do this or you shouldn't do that. I always say use the light source that you want to use for the type of image that you want to take. So knowing that hard light will accentuate everything by adding contrast, that means wrinkles, lines, pores, everything. Most people don't necessarily want to have that emphasized. So most of the time when you are looking at portraits of people, usually they are in softer light. However, there's sometimes when we want that harder light, we want the wrinkles to be accentuated, we want it to have more drama. So if we're looking at this image right here, this is very hard light. I also would tell my students there's a fence going right through her head. So, again, thinking about what's happening in the background. And here, better image, softer light. There's not a fence going through her head. So we're really thinking about where you're putting the person in the frame and also that quality of light. So same time of day, just moving that person out of that bright sun can make all the difference in the world. Same thing here. We have on the left full sun. So when people are in full sun, a lot of times they will squint. It's not the most pleasing because it's really hard for people to be in full sun versus this is an open shade. So again, what do we mean by that? It's an area that's still getting light, but not direct light. And this is, if I have no lighting gear with me, I will bring people into open shade to photograph them because I know this light is always going to look beautiful. So knowing that, just looking around sometimes, you don't have to have a lot of expensive lighting gear. These were both shot with an iPhone. Just looking at where you're photographing, moving your subject into better light can make all the difference in the world in terms of what your image looks like. And then, of course, there's time of day, the time of day that you want to photograph. So one of the things that I have my students do is photograph the same thing at 3 different times of the day, and I'll show you that. But it's usually best to shoot photos in the morning or early evening sunlight instead of the harsh afternoon sun or like middle of the day. Overcast or partly sunny days are also really good for lighting. So if we look at window light, by the way, is usually nice the whole day. But here's morning, afternoon, and evening. And you can see what's happening to those shadows and where the light is coming from. Here's another really good example, 7 a.m. before the light's really bright. 9 a.m. you get much harder shadows. 12 p.m. you can see the shadows almost directly underneath. And 7 p.m. you can see the shadows coming from that side. And this will be different, of course, depending on what time of the year it is. So looking at the quality of light at different times of the year, but looking at this orange, we can see there's like no shadows on this 7 a.m. one. So very soft light. By 9 a.m., you're already getting a very harsh highlight and a very defined shadow here. Noon, it's almost directly underneath. And then 7 p.m., it's this more beautiful, I like to say it's that golden hour where light is washing across things. So it really a much more, that's why people call it the golden hour. It's a much more beautiful sort of light. For those of you that don't know, I'm in San Luis Obispo. I teach at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, and the Madonna Inn is a big place here. And so I had one of my students that photographed that sign at 2 o'clock, at 5 o'clock, and then at 7 o'clock in the evening. And you can see the difference in what happens to those shadows. And also, I love that at 7 o'clock, you get some of that neon that starts coming on, which is kind of wonderful. So photographers pay a lot of attention to light, but shadows are equally important. And shadows are not simply that dark mass that borders the light. Rather, shadows are really an entity to themselves. And it's a shadow that really shapes the light, that draws the attention to the light. And when you integrate that, you're really going to reach your full potential as a photographer. So one of the assignments that I have my students do is actually to look for shadows. And this is a really fun thing to do as you're walking around. Just look for shadows, look for the patterns that are created, and then start noticing where is the light coming from and how are those shadows being created. And you can really get some very interesting shots just focusing on shadows. I think it's pretty amazing. And one of the very first assignments that I give my students is something called 10 by 10. What this is you stay in a 10 by 10-foot area to photograph all your images that you're going to shoot for the assignment. So I like to do this because as a first assignment, I want to make it something that's creative, that is, you have to start looking at your environment in a different way, that you really have to explore different angles, vantage points, really looking at the light, the shapes, the textures, the lines, the relationship between the objects, and really thinking about how can you change your vantage point? Maybe it's a dog's eye view or a bird's eye view, getting up higher, putting the camera where you would normally put it, and thinking about moving your image out of the center of the frame. So challenging yourself to do that. And I have the students shooting 50 exposures and then editing it down to their best 3 images. And I would say and challenge all of you, it's really easy to take photos these days. The hardest thing about being a photographer these days is not actually taking the photo or creating it. It's about doing a good editing job and editing it, distilling it down to the best images. So here are some of the shots that were taken. This is one person's shots, and she focused on much more abstract, focused on textures and colors. And I think it's just super beautiful in terms of what she was able to do in that space. Another person who was photographing and really looking at architectural elements and looking at the lines and the shapes and looking down. This is looking down at a staircase and looking through things. I think, we tend to walk by things often and not really think of them as photographs. And so I would challenge all of you to start looking on a walk, start looking at those things that maybe you wouldn't photograph, and how can you reframe it and photograph it in an interesting and unique way. And it's like anything else. The more that we photograph and practice, the better we become at taking those photographs. So, if you're a musician, you wouldn't just start playing an instrument. You're going to practice to get good at it. And I would say the same thing about photography, which is that you need to practice and train your eye and really work at it to get those photographs that you'd love to get. And the people that are photographing in all the high-end magazines, they didn't just start doing it, they actually built up a portfolio and worked towards it. So the very last assignment that I have my students do is called effective storytelling. And I love this assignment because it's really, they take everything that they learned from the quarter and they are able to bring it and distill it down into their own personal story. So I like to say, if you're on a beach with 50 other photographers and everyone is photographing the sunset, how would you convey something that's different? Your own personal story. How do you bring in your own story? So a photograph of just a beach, that's an anecdote. But if you have a photograph with a sunrise at the beach and a surfer getting into the water, that's a story. So really thinking about how can we create stories. And effective storytelling, you want to tell a good story with your photos and people want to receive the good story. So how, again, do you create the images rather than just taking the images? In this case, getting down to the dog's level and really getting that moment. How will your storytelling make your work stand out? It's your life experiences, your unique set of life experiences that shape your perception of the world that's unlike anyone else's. So how can you bring that into your photographs? Some of the key things that I would recommend thinking about when you're personalizing a photograph is provide a humorous element. That is always helpful. You can shock the viewer, include a mysterious element, capture human drama, show your specific point of view, and presenting a personal opinion. A photograph is so much more impactful to viewers when it tells a story rather than one that doesn't. So again, how do you make a good photograph great? So here's a nice photo of a young woman, but here we make it great just by moving that person, creating the image rather than just taking it, thinking about it, taking that extra moment to really create the image rather than just taking it. And I love, this is one of my favorite images that was turned in. This was a student whose wife was pregnant, and beginning of the quarter, he said, I might have to be gone because my little daughter's going to be born. And he had never taken photographs before. He always had this like hesitation to do this. And here is the first photo that he took of his little baby girl. And it's so sweet, but it's also his story. And I think, having the footprints in there, the way that he composed it, the way that he framed it, that shallower depth of field, that beautiful soft light, all of those things are going into creating this beautiful photograph. So we all have a story to tell. And I believe the more personal, the more universal the message becomes. So again, my final assignment is really thinking about what you're going to include in the frame and what you leave out of the frame. So if I go into a classroom and I photograph the whole classroom, I can show a classroom of 50 people, or I can hone in on one person. And that is my story that I'm telling about what happened in that moment. So you as a photographer, you tell your truth with each and every photograph that you take, and you can decide what you're going to leave in the frame and what you're going to leave out of the frame. So a couple of things to leave you with here, before I go into the next section, is when taking pictures, ask yourself, do you have a clearly defined subject? What feeling are you trying to invoke? And what story are you trying to tell within the frame? Try shooting your subjects from a variety of different viewpoints, from above, from the same level, from looking up. Really think about different angles that you can photograph from. If you're photographing a subject that has movement, don't worry, just keep photographing, because you never know. I use burst a lot because, especially if somebody is moving, you just never know. And in that burst of photos, you might find just the right one. Be aware of where your light source is coming from and what kind of light source it is. Is it strong? Is it soft? Is it diffused? Is it hard? Really thinking about your light source. Compose your photos in for ways that your focal point's not always in the center of the composition. Experiment maybe with putting it in your subject in the corner, or thinking about the rule of thirds. And I would say I would challenge all of you to take a look at what you photographed thus far, and perhaps recrop your images with this in mind. You can always go back in after the fact and recrop them. If you're using a cell phone, a lot of times we tend to be farther back. Get close, fill the frame, find the perfect angle. Don't be afraid to move in. Shoot a lot. The most difficult part about being a photographer, like I said before, is not creating the photographs. It's learning to be a good editor. Which images will you share with the world? Which of the ones that you've taken will be the ones that you want to put out there for people to see? And remember, as I said before, make it a habit to take photographs daily. The camera you use doesn't matter, but the act of taking the photos does. There's no better way to improve your photography than simply doing it, and doing it often. So it's like practicing an instrument, getting ready for an athletic event. The more you do it, the easier it becomes. And I just wanted to show you, because this is Wacom. I use my Wacom tablet. I use Lightroom. So even getting ready for this presentation, you're seeing a lot of my stuff here on my desk. This is where I work, and I love using it. It's such a nice complement. This is Lightroom, so that's what I use a lot of. I also will use photos if I'm using things from my camera. And so this is one way that I organize my photos that I pick. You can see here what I said about shoot a lot, pick the best. So I shoot a lot and then I pick the best, and that's a big part of the editing. So you can see a little bit of that happening here in a shot that I did recently. And I want to shift gears a little bit now, because I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done, and also talk a little bit about how you can tell a story and how you can create a video, because this lecture really was from stills to video. So I want to talk a little bit about that. This is a photo of me and my grandmother. She was the inspiration for my film Lives Well Lived, which is currently airing on PBS. And she came out to visit me for the first time when she was 96, and she lived in Florida and I'm in California. And we would cook together. And I thought I really wanted to capture her cooking. And so thankfully, the digital cameras at that time were started to do video, and I knew nothing, but I asked a lot of questions, and I started videoing her cooking. And then eventually she went back to Florida for her 100th birthday. And she was still working out at the gym at that point, and I filmed her working out at the gym. And I came back from that trip and I thought, oh my goodness, I need to find other people out there who are aging like my grandmother is, because this is remarkable and they are out there. We're just not seeing them in the media. And so I'm going to share a little 20-second clip from a trailer of the Lives Will Live film so you can get an idea of what that is about. So let's see. Hopefully it will. There we go. Nope. Of course, hang on just a second, sorry.
While you look for that, Sky, we
Thank
have
you. There we
Veronica.
go.
You're fine. Veronica in the chat says, how beautiful. I love her apron.
Thanks. Yeah, she was something else. Okay, so I might have to, let's see. I don't think that did it. Hang on a second. First, here we go. Okay. Oh, hang on a second. Let's see. I think I have to reshare that again. Yep. Okay.
I mean, I just lived my life one day at a time, and I did everything the way I thought I should do it.
It's not your numerical age, it's your biological age. So think young, act young, feel young, forget the number.
So that's just a little teeny teaser of the Lives Will Live film. And I spent 4 years interviewing 40 people with a collective life experience of 3,000 years. And you can see here that I'm filming with a couple of cameras here that are Canons. And it was such a wonderful experience. And then I also did stills of everyone, mostly using natural light because I didn't want to bring in a lot of lighting gear. And I was lucky enough to be in places where there was a lot of natural light, but really positioning people in places where we're getting really beautiful window light coming in. I also filmed them, like this is Blanche Brown, who teaches Afro-Haitian dance at ODC in San Francisco. You can see the beautiful window light coming in here. So really thinking about, in addition to doing the videos, also doing the stills of all these people and really thinking about where could I put them? Where could I put them in their own environment that told a little bit about them, something to the audience about themselves? And so this is Paul Wolf, who actually taught architecture at Cal Poly, and you can see him with his architecture drawings there. Ken Schwartz, who was a mayor of San Luis Obispo, but also was an artist, and you see some of his work in the background, and Evie Justison and her studio. So really paying attention to, if you're going to photograph somebody, how can you bring in some elements of who they are and a little bit about them. So again, that's like the idea of creating an image rather than just taking an image, and going into the studio and really just photographing a lot and not knowing what you're going to find and what photo is going to be the best. And I like to say that my grandmother gave me the greatest gift, which is that through doing this film, I feel like I have 40 new grandparents and 40 new friends. And I love this intergenerational connection. And so one of the things that we've done with the film here at Cal Poly is work with a psychology of aging class. And we show the Lives Will Live film to students and older adults. And they use the questions that I formulated for the film to ask each other as to start a bilateral conversation. And then I am lucky enough that I get to do a big photo shoot. And you can see here just kind of a behind the scenes. These are some lights. They're called Pro Photos, and just a couple of umbrellas to give us soft light, because I have the light going through the umbrellas. It's giving us soft light. You can see the photograph comes up here on the laptop. And it's just so much fun to see these groups of individuals together and what that looks like. And I, on these, really very intentionally put them against a white background because I really just wanted it to be about the relationship between the older adult and the student. And so sometimes it's nice to get rid of that environment and really just make it about the people that you're photographing and make it about that relationship that you can see that's going on here. And I have a big white sweep that I take with me when I do things like this, and I just set it up. It's not a big deal to set that up. And it's really gets rid of a lot of the clutter. So that is a good thing to do. And this is just some of the people that I've photographed throughout the time. We've been doing this for about 8 years, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful project. And then the students at the end do a big presentation where they talk a little bit about what they learned from the person that they worked with and what the secret to a life well lived is. So it's really just a wonderful, wonderful project. And of course, one of the things that they all learn is that we have far more in common than our differences, and that really the biggest difference is our age, but everything else is so much more in common. And I love that PBS, because the film is on PBS Learning Media has picked this up as well. So if there's any educators out there, K through 12, you can go to the PBS Learning Media site and actually use this project, and it's free. And all the resources, the Common Core standards are all there. So it's very easy to plug and play into a classroom. So that's kind of just a little plug for that. And I really love that it's out there and accessible for lots of people. And so the other thing is, and I think that Shireen's going to put in the chat, there is a take action part of the Lives Will Live website where you can actually download all the questions and the whole description of how to do this project on your own. And I'm going to just go over a few of the interview techniques that I learned along the way because I had never done interviews before. So this is all new for me. And I just thought it'd be helpful for those of you that are interested in doing a project like this. Some of the things that I learned along the way: make your subject as comfortable as possible. So warm up. The first time that I would meet people, I didn't even bring my camera gear. I would just meet them and talk to them because I wanted them to be comfortable when I did bring my camera gear. I would start filming right away, even during setup, because that was usually when the great stuff happened. Tell people what you're looking for and why. What are you doing this project for? Why are you asking these questions? And prepare accordingly. So I would know everybody's bio, but I would have an idea of where I wanted the interview to go, but remain adaptable so that when a really amazing story comes up, you can pivot and do something different. These are just a bunch of the questions that I asked everyone. Again, this is on the website, so you're more than welcome to download them and use them. Please use them to interview people in your lives. And my interview techniques were I avoided using yes or no questions, because if you do that, you're usually just going to get a yes or no answer. I was always listening for the soundbite. I was always listening for what that pearl of wisdom was going to happen. And if it happened, but it was kind of, in between and with a lot of other stuff, sometimes I would say, oh, my audio gear, I didn't turn it on. Can we redo that? And can you say this thing again? I would always blame my audio gear rather than saying to them, oh, you didn't say that quite right. I would always blame it on me and my gear and something that I did wrong. And then leave spaces to breathe. You never know when you leave that space what's going to happen. I also like to say that audio is vital. Even though we are image makers, audio is key. There are so many times where if you're watching something on YouTube, if it has a bad image quality but good sound, you'll watch it through to the end. But the other way around, if it has really bad audio, you're going to turn it off. So really getting good audio. Lighting your subject. When you think about lighting, we talked a little bit about that. What is your key light? Your key light could be the sun. You might want to soften or diffuse the light. Like we talked about, that softer light. I use this thing called a 5-in-1 reflector, which is about $30 on Amazon. And you can really do a lot of things with it, which is to bounce light, to diffuse light. So it's definitely worth it. And you can see here, this is diffusing some light that's coming in onto my subject CL over here. The other alternative is LED lights. I actually have an LED light on, not on me, but bouncing off of a wall and back onto me. Bounced light is always more beautiful than light that's directly on a subject. So when you think about lighting, here's somebody right in front of a window versus the light that's coming from the side and from the front. So thinking about where you are placing your subject in relationship to the light. Choosing your location really carefully. So in this one, I love this painting in the background. It gave a really beautiful red background. So thinking about where you're going to film or photograph the person that you're photographing. And then thinking about setting up the shot. So we talked about the rule of thirds, thinking about that. I mentioned thinking about your background, thinking about having a shallower depth of field so that your subject separates from the background. I always use a tripod. I think when you're doing an interview, having really shaky video is just difficult to watch. So even if you're shooting with your iPhone or your Android, putting that on something that's not moving is super helpful. And then, like I said, recording audio is vital. So thinking about how you're going to record audio, I use something called a pin mic. You can see it right there. It almost disappears. And it's just really, you can use a lav mic, just something that you can connect even to your iPhone is going to give you much better sound than just the sound on your camera or your phone. And then thinking about what's called B-roll footage. So B-roll footage is the stuff that, like, while maybe this is Santi Visali, maybe he's talking about something, I'm putting some footage of him cooking over that. Or same thing here, this was Lucky Louie making mozzarella, and I'm filming him making the mozzarella so that we can see that rather than just having that footage of a talking head. So the next project that I've been working on is called Mochisuki. And this is Susie Edo Bauman, who was in my film. She's Japanese American. And she told me about this Mochisuki ceremony, which is a Japanese American or Japanese tradition that has been carried over to the United States. And it's about making mochi to bring in the new year. And what is mochi? So it's not mochi ice cream, which many of you probably seen in Trader Joe's or Costco. It is actually rice that is steamed and then pounded and made into a paste that's like the consistency of bread, like that would, and then they roll it into mochi balls. And you might say, why would I be interested in that? Well, between Susie, who is in my Lives Well Lived film, and these are my two nephews who are Japanese American. I just was very interested in that and their culture and learning a little bit more about that. And so I dove into this project. And I always say the more personal, the more universal. And this was certainly in that regard a personal project as well as the Lives Well Lived project. So this is the steaming of the rice early in the morning. You can see it's just such a beautiful process. And then it is pounded in an usu, which is this right here with these mallets. And you can see we're photographing. I have a couple of people photographing and filming with me. So I think that's really, having some help is really important when you're doing a project like this. You need a lot of different vantage points. And it is just such a beautiful, beautiful ceremony that happens. And generations come together. I love this intergenerational connection because I think all of you can probably think about something that you did around food that brought your family or friends together. And by the way, here is the mochi coming out. So you can see it's kind of like a smooth sort of surface. And then it is made into these round mochi balls. So you can see they're kind of pulling off these round mochi balls. And this is what it looks like in the end. So again, looking at vantage point, shooting over somebody's shoulder, shooting from up above, shooting different ways, really moving in close, really feeling like you're capturing that moment. And this is what the mochi looks like when it's done. So this is shot from up above. This is kind of shot from mochi vantage point. And each family has their name on the mochi there, and you can see that. It's kind of fun. And again, I love that intergenerational connection of grandfather and granddaughter coming together to make this mochi. And this is the whole family getting together for that. And Shireen, how are we doing on time? Do I have time, a little more time, or are we
Yep,
good?
you're doing great.
Okay, so I want to show you a little, just 20-second trailer. I'll just for time of Mochisuki. So let me do that. So if anybody is interested, that film is going to be on PBS in May of 2025 for Asian American Pacific Islander Month, but you can actually see a sneak preview of it, a 20-minute sneak preview of it now. I think Shireen's going to put that website in the chat for you. And then lastly, the very last film that I'm working on is called The Primetime Band. And this is also near and dear to my heart because I was a band geek. I played flute, clarinet, and bassoon in high school and junior high school. And I heard about this band where it's people primarily in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s who used to play music earlier in life and put their instruments away, and later in life come back to their instruments and play. They rehearse every Tuesday night, and then they perform throughout Santa Barbara County. And you can see they have ailments. Like this woman, Heather, she can't hold up the flute anymore. So she found a way to have a headstock so she doesn't have to hold up the flute anymore. Or we have Tom here who has Parkinson's, but still manages to get there and play every Tuesday night. And then when they perform, it's pretty remarkable to see that. So I have a very little clip. You're going to see, this is a work in progress. So you're going to see, just even with like the time code on there, because it's really new, but there's just a little 1-minute clip. So I'll share that with you now.
I played the trombone because it was the only instrument the orthodontist thought was okay for my braces. So when I was going off to college, I really wanted to be in the University of Nebraska marching band. And so I made a tape with my first initial and my last name, and I sent it in, and I was accepted into the trombone section. And then they found out that I was a girl, and they didn't take girls in the marching band in those days. So I put away my trombone, didn't play again until Primetime Band.
Barb had mentioned to me one time, you know, you play the flute? Well, God, I used to play the trombone. I said, well, you have to come join the band, you know, play the trombone. She said, oh, I don't even have a trombone anymore. She said, I wouldn't be able to make the notes. My chops are gone. I'm shot. I don't even know how to make a sound. And it was probably a year later, after encouraging her, that I thought, she's never going to do this on her own. So I went down to Nick Rail and I said, I'm going to rent a trombone for somebody for a few months. Tied a bow around it. It was so fun.
And so I was kind of like obligated to show up for rehearsal. I had not played a trombone for 40 years.
So that's just a little sneak peek of the Primetime Band. It's really been just a fun project to work on. And many of the people in the Primetime Band are also part of a group called the Music Band, which goes into elementary schools to third grade classrooms, literally with a van full of instruments, and introduces music and instruments to those 8-year-olds, many of whom have never touched an instrument before. And they have a brass section, a woodwind section, a percussion section, and a string section. And those students get to try every single instrument. And what a joy that is to see. So we're working on that right now. And on my website, you can see a little more of that as well. So those are some of the things I'm working on. And finally, I recently released a book on Amazon. It's available, so you can check that out. It's a lot of the lessons that I learned from making the Lives We'll Live film, but also the second half of it is devoted to people that are doing amazing work around the globe connecting generations, whether it's through an intergenerational symphony or climate change or housing. It's just been amazing to interview all these people. So with that, I want to say thank you. I think I've talked long enough, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any that came up.
Thank you so much, Sky. This is also awesome. We actually don't have any more questions in the chat. You were so thorough. I think you covered everything. But I did want to remind everybody that I was dropping links in the chat. So if you're interested in Sky's book or any of the films that she was just talking about, please check out the chat. All of the links are there. And I believe you can go to the Primetime Band link and donate and support Sky's film. So please head over there and help Sky out with that. Awesome. Thank you, Sky.
Thank you.
Before we go, I'm going to share my screen one last time because we have a special offer for everybody here. So if you head over to our e-store and use the code Summer Savings, you can get 15% off of these products listed here. So feel free to take a screenshot of that and head over to the e-store and get that savings while you can. And that is it from me. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. And thank you so much again, Sky. It's always a pleasure hanging out with you.
Indeed. Thank you. Thanks to everyone that was here today. I really appreciate it.
Have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.